Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about how ancient Athenians, so people from Athens, were considered citizens. Okay, so we're looking at how democracy came about in ancient Athens. So let's get started here. So, a city state, which you already know is also called a polis, is made up of a city and surrounding countryside. It is independent of other cities. They had their own laws and built up their own armies, right? So, if you think about city states, we know quite a few, but the two most important and the most memorable were the Athenians, so Athens city state, and then, of course, the Spartans, right? And both very different in their own way. They had their own laws and their own culture and their own way of dealing things. They had their own armies, um, but they were also considered a city state. So, when we're looking at the birth of democracy, because remember, democracy was developed in ancient Athens, we have to think about what came before democracy. So, in ancient Athens, there was tyrants. And tyrants are rulers who seize power and govern in a harsh, cruel way. They demanded obedience from their people, and they were usually really rich and really powerful. So, a tyrant is someone who is not good. And if a country had a tyrant as a leader, it usually meant that it was the only person that was making, there was only one person making decisions for an entire country. And tyrants were really common back in ancient Greece, and a lot of different cities, all city states all over ancient Greece, had different tyrants. But as you can probably tell, tyrants weren't the best way of governing a city. And so we're going to get into that right now. So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a tyrant rule? Well, advantages mean what are the good things, and disadvantages mean what are the bad things of having a tyrant rule over your city. Well, the advantages are if you yourself were the tyrant, well, then of course things would be great. You are rich, you've got uncontrollable power, you punish anyone who disobeys you. But if you weren't that tyrant, my goodness, that would not be a really great place, be a really good place to live, right? So, the disadvantages, the bad things about having a tyrant as a ruler, one person ruling over you, is that it wasn't fair to the people. They had no say in solving any problems. And this usually made people riot a lot. So, a riot is when a group of people who can't express what they want to their government, if they are continually being told no, eventually will riot, which means they go to like a very violent measure to have what they believe important to them being heard by the person in government. Now, you don't see a lot of people in our modern day society rioting because luckily we live in a democracy where democracy meaning ruled by the people, which means everybody has a say. There aren't a lot of countries in our modern day society that have tyrants or one person making all of the decisions for them because we've really taken on this idea of fairness. Okay? So, would you want to be a part of the city state that was a part of a tyrant rule? Well, I for sure would say no. And that's because I myself feel like I should have a right in a say in how my government rules, right? So let's look at the reasons why Athenians might change their government system from the tyrant rule to democracy. Well, think of all the amazing things that come out of democracy. It makes things fair, that citizens can have their own opinion, it prevents riots and war, and most importantly, it creates a democracy which is freedom of the people, right? It allows people to decide how their government is going to help them. So, if you ask me, tyranny out, democracy in. Now, in order to be a part of this democratic rule, you had to be of a certain social standing. So that means that you had to have been born into a specific social standing. So if you think about it, in our modern day society, it doesn't really matter, right? The Charter of Rights has made it so that it doesn't matter what you look like, what if you're a man or a woman, what race you belong to, what religion you are all treated as equals. Well, that wasn't quite the case in ancient Athens. There were 3 different social structures, and only men could participate in the democratic government. Okay? And you had to be from a certain social standing in order to participate in the democratic government. But first, let's look at the different social structures in ancient Athens, okay? So we've got the citizen, the metic, and the slave. And you can already kind of tell that the people who were part of the slave social standing probably didn't get to be involved. So citizens were usually children of parents who were born in Athens. Only male citizens could appreciate or participate in voting and governing in the city. A young man became a citizen after he finished his military service at the age of 20. Women could not participate in Athenian democracy. So if you were a citizen, it usually means you were born a citizen. You were born within the city walls, the city boundaries, not outside of Athens. And you had to be from a certain social standing, okay? In that a lot of citizens were usually came from wealthy, rich families. Not all of them. There were also poor citizens, poor Athenian citizens. But you had to be born in Athens to a family who was already citizens, okay? And remember, this is only male. Women were not considered citizens at all. Didn't matter if they came from a wealthy family or if they came from a family that was already considered citizens. Women were never considered citizens. Females, no matter how high born, could not become citizens. Slaves and foreigners could not become citizens. Also, man slaves could not be citizens either. Citizens were expected to attend regular meetings as well as serve in the army or navy. So it did not matter what you were born as. If you weren't born to a citizen, then you could not be a citizen. You couldn't be anything else and work your way up to a citizen. So if you were a citizen in ancient Athens, you had it pretty good, to be honest. The next level was the metics, and the metics were residents of Athens who had been born outside of the city-state. So if you were born on a farm outside of the city, outside of Athens, then you were not a citizen. You were considered a metic. And they were not allowed to own their own land or could not become citizens, okay? So even if you were born outside of Athens and you had a lot of money, you could never be a citizen, because you were born outside of the city. And you could never change that, okay? Most medics usually had some kind of craftsmanship. So they were builders, or they were pottery makers, or they had very important jobs throughout Athens. But again, they had no say in their government. Medics were very important to the Athenian economy because they had important jobs. They still had to serve in the military, just like citizens did, and they still had to pay their taxes, just like citizens did as well, okay? Could not participate in political life in Athens. If indeed the 3 figures to the right are medics, then Athens at least honored them by allowing them to participate in festivals. So even though that they couldn't participate in the government, there were other things that they could do. Now we have our slaves, and we all know just from grade 5, learning about the slaves in the United States, that slavery is bad, and it was wrong back then too. So here, slaves were owned either by private Athenians or by the city-state. Many slaves were people who had been taken prisoner when their city-state was attacked by Athenians. Slaves could not become citizens. So by no means could a slave become a citizen because they belonged to someone else. They were somebody else's property. They were maybe a very wealthy family's property, or maybe they belonged to this Athens, the city of Athens, as their property. Okay? Slaves could be found everywhere. They worked not only as servants, but as factory workers, shoe keepers, mine workers, farm workers, and even as ship crewmen. There may have been as many, if not more, slaves than free people in ancient Greece. It is difficult for historians to determine exactly how many slaves there were during these times, because many did not appear any different from poor Greek citizens. There were many different ways in which a person could have become a slave in ancient Greece. They might have been born into slavery as a child of a slave. So slaves made up a huge population of the Greek and Athenian population, okay? They were about 1/3 of the population. And it didn't really matter. They didn't have a choice. They could never not be a slave. They couldn't buy themselves out of slavery. Once you were born a slave, you were a slave. And they worked all over the city doing different jobs, okay? So think about which social structure, where in the social structure between citizens, medics, and slavery would be the best place to be, which social standing would you want to be a part of, and which one you wouldn't want to be a part of. Head back to D2L, read through the information, and then answer the questions, okay?